Somewhere tonight, someone is going to light something up. A small ritual, a lighter click, a slow exhale. You probably think of it as a modern habit, a college dorm thing, a festival thing, a stress relief thing born out of the 20th century. But the real answer is far stranger. Humans were doing this 8,000 years before Christ was born. Not in secret, not in shame, in public, at funerals, in front of entire communities gathered to mourn their dead. You inherited this ritual. You just don't know how old it really is. Start with a mountain range most people can't point to on a map. The Pamirs, a brutal stretch of high-altitude terrain where China, Tajikistan, and Afghanistan blur together. Cold, thin air. Nothing grows easily there. And yet in 2019, a team led by archaeologist Ren Meng uncovered something that rewrote the timeline of human intoxication entirely. Wooden braziers, small portable burners, buried inside a 2,500-year-old cemetery called Jirzankal. Inside those braziers, researchers found chemical residue, not ash from ordinary firewood. A specific compound signature, cannabinol, the byproduct of burned cannabis. And not just any cannabis. This variety carried unusually high levels of THC, the psychoactive compound that alters mood and perception. Someone thousands of years ago had deliberately selected a stronger strain of plant. Someone knew the difference between a weak batch and a potent one. Think about that for a second. That means selection. That means knowledge passed down. That means humans were already experimenting with plant potency before they had written language to record the discovery. Why does that matter? Because it proves this wasn't accidental smoke inhalation from a campfire. This was intentional, structured, ritualized. Robert Spengler, an archaeobotanist who studies ancient plant use, helped analyze the findings. His conclusion was blunt. The people burning this cannabis were almost certainly doing it as part of a funeral rite. Mourners gathered around a body. Smoke rose from the braziers, and the community together entered an altered state as a form of collective grief processing. Picture it. Not a solitary high, a shared one. An entire village breathing the same smoke, staring at the same fire, saying goodbye to the same person. Intoxication in this context wasn't escape. It was connection. Now travel north, into the frozen steppe of Siberia. A culture called the Pazyryk lived here roughly 2,400 years ago. Nomadic, fierce, buried their dead beneath massive earthen mounds called kurgans. And because of the extreme cold, something remarkable happened to those burial sites. The permafrost preserved them. Tattooed skin, woven textiles, wooden artifacts, all frozen in time like a sealed capsule. Inside several of these tombs, archaeologists found small tent-like structures, leather pouches full of hemp seeds, metal sensors designed to hold hot stones. The same setup Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian, described almost word for word around 450 BCE. He wrote about the Scythians, close cultural relatives of the Pazyryk, throwing hemp seeds onto heated stones inside enclosed tents. He described the resulting vapor as something that made people howl with pleasure. Read that again. A Greek historian, writing over 2,000 years ago, described what is functionally a sweat lodge cannabis vapor session. Long before vaporizers existed as a modern invention, humans had already built one out of stone, leather, and fire. You probably assume vaping was a 2010s trend. It wasn't. It was a 5th century BCE technology. And the Scythians didn't stop at ritual tents. Grave goods recovered from their burial mounds include gold ornaments shaped like coiled animals, decorated bridal gear, and small felt bags, many still containing traces of hemp. Archaeologists studying these mounds noted something striking. The vessels used for the ritual weren't crude. They were crafted with the same care as the weapons and jewelry buried alongside them, which tells you the practice wasn't a marginal habit tucked into the corners of Scythian life. It sat at the center of it, worthy of fine metalwork and careful preservation. Here's where the story gets even stranger. In 2008, ethnopharmacologist Ethan Russo led an analysis of a burial site in Yonghai, near Turpan in western China. Inside the tomb of a man believed to be a shaman, researchers found nearly 2 pounds of preserved plant material. Cannabis. Not seeds scattered by accident. a deliberately harvested, carefully stored stash, placed beside the body like a tool he might need in the next life. Russo's team tested the material. It still contained detectable levels of THC after roughly 2,700 years underground, which meant this wasn't hemp grown for fiber or rope. Hemp grown for rope doesn't need psychoactive potency. This plant had been specifically selected, harvested, and preserved for its mind-altering properties. So ask yourself the obvious question. If a man was buried with his cannabis stash the way a soldier might be buried with his sword, what does that tell you about how central this plant was to his identity? It tells you cannabis wasn't a recreational afterthought in the ancient world. It was medicine. It was ritual. It was, in some cases, sacred enough to travel into the afterlife with you. Here's the twist most people don't expect. This wasn't confined to one culture or one bloodline. Genetic research published in the journal Science Advances traced the origin of cannabis domestication back roughly 12,000 years to East Asia, likely near what is now China. From there, the plant appears to have split into two broad lineages. One selected over generations for its fiber, used to make rope, cloth, and paper. The other selected for its chemical potency, carried west along trade routes into Central Asia, the Middle East, and eventually Europe. Two versions of the same species. One built to clothe humanity, the other built to alter its consciousness. Both spreading side by side along the same ancient roads that carried silk, spices, and metal. Consider how far that potent lineage traveled. By the time it reached the ancient Near East, cannabis residue shows up in incense altars uncovered at a shrine in Tel Arad, Israel, dating back roughly 2,700 years. Frankincense burned on one altar. Cannabis burned on another, right beside it, inside the same sacred space. Which suggests that in at least some ancient religious traditions, this plant wasn't separate from worship. It was part of it, standing shoulder to shoulder with the incense used to honor the divine. Keep following that trail west, and you land in Egypt. Paleopathologists examining royal mummies, including remains linked to Ramesses II, have identified plant pollen consistent with cannabis packed among the wrappings. Was it medicinal? Was it symbolic, meant to ease pain and stiffness in the afterlife the way it may have eased them in life? The evidence doesn't give a clean answer, but it places the plant inside the most elite, most carefully curated burial practice in the ancient world. Not a fringe habit. A substance considered worthy of accompanying a king into eternity. And here's a detail that should reshape how you picture who was doing all this. The burials aren't exclusively male. Archaeologists working Scythian and Pazaric sites have identified female warriors and priestesses interred with the same hemp-related grave goods as the men beside them. This wasn't a boys' club activity, hidden away from half the population. Men and women, warriors and shamans, elders and the newly dead, all appear tied to the same ritual smoke. You live in a world obsessed with categorizing drugs as either purely medical or purely recreational. Ancient cultures didn't draw that line so cleanly. To them, altering the mind wasn't separate from healing the body. A shaman burning cannabis over hot stones wasn't getting high for fun. He was performing a function. Communicating with ancestors. Easing physical pain, guiding a community through grief. The intoxication was the mechanism, not the goal. Does that sound familiar? It should, because you still do a version of this today, even if you've never thought about it that way. Consider how many rituals in your own life involve a substance meant to shift your state of mind. A glass of wine at a wedding toast. Incense burned at a funeral. Coffee consumed as a shared morning ritual before anyone speaks. You still reach for chemistry to mark transitions. Birth, death, celebration, mourning. The substances change. The instinct doesn't. Anthropologists have a term for this pattern. Altered states as social glue. Shared intoxication in controlled ritual settings appears to strengthen group bonding. It synchronizes emotion. It creates a collective memory tied to a specific moment. When the Pazarics sat together inside that leather tent inhaling hemp vapor, they weren't just getting high together. They were bonding together, building trust, reinforcing the invisible threads that held a nomadic society together across brutal winters and constant movement. Your brain, it turns out, hasn't changed nearly as much as your technology has. The dopamine pathways that respond to cannabis today are the same pathways that responded to it 8,000 years ago in the Pamirs. The craving for altered perception, for a break from ordinary consciousness, appears to be baked into human neurology itself, not invented by any single culture or century. There's a deeper biological reason this connection runs so deep. In 1992, chemist Raphael Mechoulam, the same researcher who first identified the molecular structure of THC decades earlier, helped discover that the human body already produces its own version of these compounds. He named it anandamide, borrowing from the Sanskrit word for bliss. Your brain manufactures a natural cannabinoid every single day, binding to the exact same receptors that plant-based cannabis activates, which means the ancient people burning hemp over hot stones weren't introducing something foreign into their nervous systems. They were amplifying a signal your body already knows how to send. The plant didn't invent the sensation. It just turned up the volume on something already wired into you. That reframes the entire ritual, doesn't it? A shaman inhaling smoke at Yonghai wasn't hijacking his brain chemistry. He was speaking its native language. So why does the myth persist that ancient humans were somehow purer, more sober, more disciplined than modern people? Why do so many assume intoxication is a symptom of decadence, something that arrived with cities, with leisure, with modern boredom? Maybe because it's comforting to believe our ancestors were simpler than us. Maybe because admitting they got high at funerals complicates the tidy story we tell about human progress moving in a straight line from primitive to civilized. But the archaeology doesn't support that comforting version. The archaeology says humans have been chemically altering their consciousness, deliberately and skillfully, since before the invention of writing. Think about the timeline for a moment. Agriculture emerged roughly 12,000 years ago. Writing emerged roughly 5,000 years ago. Cannabis domestication, according to the genetic evidence, may predate written language by thousands of years, which means humans figured out how to select for a stronger high before they figured out how to write down a recipe, a law, or a prayer. That reframes everything, doesn't it? The desire to alter perception isn't a byproduct of civilization. It might be one of the forces that helped build civilization. Shared ritual, shared altered states, shared grief and celebration around a fire. These are the glue that held small, fragile human groups together long enough to become something bigger. Here's another detail worth sitting with. The burial at Yonghai wasn't unique in its combination of shamanic tools. Alongside the cannabis, researchers found other objects associated with spiritual practice, including a harp-like instrument and a woven basket of grains, which suggests the man buried there wasn't simply a heavy user. He was likely a specialist, someone whose role in the community involved deliberately entering altered states to access some form of insight, healing, or connection that ordinary daily consciousness couldn't reach. You could call that an ancient version of a therapist, or a doctor, or a priest. The lines blurred in ways your modern categories struggle to describe. And this pattern doesn't stop with cannabis. Archaeologists have found evidence of psychoactive plant use stretching across nearly every continent. Fermented drinks in Neolithic China, some containing residue of rice, honey, and hawthorn fruit combined specifically to produce intoxication. Psilocybin mushroom imagery carved into rock art in the Sahara, potentially over 7,000 years old. Coca leaf residue found in South American burial sites and mummified remains dating back thousands of years, with chewed leaves sometimes still tucked inside cheek cavities. The specific plant changed based on what grew locally. The underlying behavior did not, which raises an uncomfortable but fascinating question. What if altering consciousness isn't a modern indulgence layered on top of human nature, but one of the oldest expressions of human nature itself? What if the urge to step outside ordinary awareness, to touch something bigger than the daily grind of survival, is as old as the urge to bury the dead, or paint on cave walls, or gather around fire and tell stories? There's a biological angle here too, one that researchers studying plant evolution find almost too neat to be coincidence. Many of the plants humans domesticated for psychoactive use, including cannabis, opium poppy, and coca, evolved their chemical defenses originally to deter insects and grazing animals. Humans, uniquely among mammals, seem to have flipped that defense mechanism into an attraction. What repels almost every other species on the planet became, for humans alone, something worth cultivating, refining, and carrying across continents. That is not a small evolutionary quirk. That is a species deliberately seeking out compounds designed to be avoided by nearly everything else that eats plants. Why would evolution allow that? Some researchers argue it wasn't a mistake at all. A species that could tolerate, even enjoy, mild plant toxins gained something valuable. Pain relief during injury. Appetite stimulation during famine. A shared communal experience that bonded small, vulnerable groups together during the most dangerous stretches of prehistory, long before hospitals, before therapy, before anything resembling modern medicine existed. The tolerance for altered states may have been less a flaw in human biology and more a survival tool, quietly selected for across thousands of generations. Think, too, about what it took to even get to the Pamirs in the first place. This isn't a lowland river valley with easy soil and mild weather. It's one of the harshest inhabited environments on the planet, with thin oxygen and brutal winters. And yet the people living there still carried braziers, hot stones, and carefully selected high-potency plant material across those mountain passes. They didn't stumble into this ritual by accident along an easy trade route. They committed real effort, real resources, to keep it alive at extreme altitude. That tells you something about priority. When survival itself demands most of your energy, and you still make room for ritual intoxication, that ritual isn't a luxury. It's essential. Return, for a moment, to that image from the Pamir Mountains. A community standing around a body. Wooden braziers glowing with hot coals. Smoke rising, carrying a strong strain of cannabis into the freezing mountain air. No modern lighter. No rolling paper. No dispensary. Just fire, plant, and grief transformed together into something communal. Now compare that scene to a modern one. A dispensary counter. Glass jars labeled with strain names and THC percentages. A world that has, in some places, fully legalized what was once whispered about or hidden entirely. It can feel like a radical, unprecedented shift. But zoom out far enough, and it starts to look less like something new and more like something returning. A slow swing back toward a normalization that existed openly, at funerals and shrines, thousands of years before Prohibition ever existed to swing away from. Prohibition itself, in the long arc of human history, is the outlier. Cannabis moved openly along trade routes for thousands of years before any government criminalized it. The idea that this plant belongs in the shadows is barely a century old, a brief chapter tucked inside a much longer story of open, communal, even sacred use. Legal or illegal, whispered or shouted, the plant itself never changed. Only the surrounding culture's willingness to admit what it was doing changed. They weren't rebels. They weren't outliers. They were doing something so deeply human that traces of it survive in your own habits today, encoded not in memory, but in behavior passed down across hundreds of generations. So tonight, when someone lights something up, whether it's a candle, cigarette, incense, or something stronger, know that you're witnessing the tail end of a ritual stretching back at least 8,000 years. A ritual that once brought entire villages together around fire and smoke to mark the edges of life and death. The real answer was never that ancient humans avoided altering their minds. The real answer is that they built entire cultures, entire rituals, entire farewells to the dead around doing exactly that. And somewhere tonight, someone is going to light something up. A small ritual, a lighter click, a slow exhale. You probably think of it as a modern habit. It never was.